Welcome to the Disney Parks Podcast with your hosts, Tony Casanova from DisneyByTheNumbers.com and Parkhopper John from WDWParkhoppers.com. Keep your hands, arms, feet, and legs inside the podcast at all times. And get ready for the Disney Parks Podcast.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Disney Parks Podcast. We have got a great show for you. We've got an incredible guest. I cannot wait to get into it. As a 43-year consultant to the Walt Disney Company, Don Dorsey has been associated with literally hundreds of Disney's entertainment events and productions. And Don created and directed the $22 million nighttime millennium-themed spectacle Reflections of Earth for Epcot. He also designed and directed the popular nighttime spectaculars Laserphonic Fantasy, IllumiNations, and Holiday IllumiNations at Epcot, Sorcery In The Sky at Disney MGM Studios, Starlight Magic at Tokyo Disneyland, and he also played a key developmental role in Disneyland's Fantasmic, and so much more. I cannot wait to get into this. Welcome to the show, everybody, Mr. Don Dorsey.
Hey, guys. How you doing?
Don, we'd like to ask everybody how their journey with Disney began. I mean, you've been now a consultant for 43 years. I mean, we could probably do a whole show from that. But how did you get started? I mean, how did Disney come knocking on your door?
Well, I grew up in a town called Fullerton, which is about 5 miles north of Disneyland. And we could see the fireworks from our front porch at night. And my dad was a chemist at that time. And every so often, as a special treat, we would drive down to Disneyland and park across the street at what is now Howard Johnson's and sit on the hood of the car and watch the fireworks. And my dad would talk to me about the fireworks and what made the different colors and so on. And that was a sort of a standard family outing several times a year to go watch the fireworks that way. I didn't really visit the park very often, and my prospective employment, I guess you'd call it, with Disney began in 1971 when I bought my first synthesizer, and that led to contact with the Moog Company distributor in the LA and Orange County areas. And when Jack Wagner, then the voice of Disneyland and producer for the entertainment division, needed to borrow a synthesizer, my name was mentioned, and I was introduced to Jack. And Jack and I became pals, and he kept tabs on my studio work and my production work with local bands and groups, and came to a concert that I had arranged with the local junior college. I was doing a live synthesizer performance with their concert band, and afterwards he came up and said, I would probably have a job for you in a year or so. And in fact, he did. And that first project, where I actually worked at Jack's place for a real Disney project, was America on Parade.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about that parade, America on Parade, what type of music was used, and how that whole spectacular, I would say, I don't know how you would define it any differently, how that all came to be.
I think it may be one of the largest parades Disney has ever produced. And it was designed to run just for the bicentennial celebration in 1975 and 1976. And Bob Yanni, who was the vice president of entertainment at that time, was fascinated by synthesized music and the first electrical parade, and also the historical sound of carousel organs, band organs as they're called, mechanical instruments from the turn of the century and Europe and early America. And he envisioned combining those two sound qualities, the electronics with the traditional mechanical instrument sounds. And so what we did was Disney found a band organ called Sadie Mae, shipped her to Nashville, where Jack Wagner and Jim Christensen recorded her, brought the 16-track tapes back to Anaheim and set up a little production studio in Jack's dining room. And then I moved in with all my synthesizers, and we spent a couple of months overdubbing to all of the existing band organ tracks and creating new textures and sounds. And that was the sound of America on Parade.
Now, was that done in both parks, Don, or was that just done at Disney World?
It was actually produced as a major bicentennial event for both parks.
Okay.
And Walt Disney World's parade opened first. And basically, I thought my work with Disney was over when America on Parade was finished. I had done the audio mix downs and done all the post-production and prep of the masters for both the parade and the souvenir album. And Jack Wagner said, why don't you come to Florida and see the parade open? So I asked permission from my parents because I was still a youngster living at home. They said, sure, go, have a good time. And so I sort of tagged around with Jack during the rehearsals and technical meetings and production meetings, and sort of came to be seen and feel like his assistant. And indeed, when we came back to California after the parade had opened there, Jack asked Bob Yanni if he could hire me full-time as his protege. So at that point, I began working with Jack out of his home studio, producing announcements, editing music, doing master tapes for this and that and the other thing, and became the recording engineer for the entertainment division, which I did up until 1992 when we finished Fantasmic. That was when I sort of took that cap off and moved into a different direction.
What was it like being that young and seeing something that massive being launched at a major theme park?
Boy, it's really hard to describe what it felt like. It was kind of like being caught up in a whirlwind of a dream. You know, every day I'm sort of pinching myself and going, I can't believe that I'm with all of these super professional people doing this massive thing in this gigantic theme park. Up until that time, I'd only seen Disneyland, which, as you know, is a much smaller scale. And to be standing on the street of Walt Disney World with an 18-story castle instead of a 2-story castle is a bit overwhelming for a California kid. But I got used to it pretty quickly and got along with everybody there and got to see a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff and probably made more lasting company ties and friendships than I had ever thought I would.
It's interesting because my first time to Walt Disney World was in 1976. And I've actually saw that parade as a 13-year-old kid standing on Main Street. So, and it made quite a big impression. I was like, wow, this is fascinating how they can pull this off every day at 3 o'clock. So it's very cool.
Way to make me feel old.
Sorry, I did not mean that. So tell us how... Go ahead.
I have a little anecdote about opening day.
Sure.
As you know, that parade featured these very large head dolls. Mm-hmm. And it being Florida and June, it was quite hot and quite humid. And for the very first parade performance, I was standing on Main Street about 3 or 4 layers of people back, so I could basically just see the tops of people marching down the street. And I remember vividly when one of them came in front of me, suddenly it just dropped out of view. And the poor performer had just collapsed on the street, and a bunch of people rushed over and carried them off out of sight, and the parade went on. But I kept thinking, boy, I sure wouldn't want to be in one of those big-headed characters trying to dance all the way down from Frontierland to Town Square.
Right. Yeah.
That's crazy.
I think back then, it almost looked like those heads were like made out of a paper mache or something. So they were probably pretty heavy.
They were molded plastic, and they had special back braces and neck supports. They did not have any air conditioning, though.
Right.
So it was quite a chore for those performers. And once we got back to Disneyland and the parade opened, I actually stepped into a couple of those costumes on various occasions just to experience it. And it was quite something, let me tell you.
I can imagine.
I have great appreciation for what those people went through to present that pageant for us.
I always say that is the probably one of the toughest jobs in the park, is being an entertainer in one of the furry costumes, or even non-furry costumes are probably very hot as well.
Well, but the furry ones are furrier.
Yeah, right. So tell us how the Mickey track was developed and how the system is used today to sync up the music and the floats as the parade goes down its parade route.
Well, Mickey track is the unofficial name that we gave to the very first parade control system that we developed in 1980 for the 25th anniversary of Disneyland. And none of that is used anymore. It's all gone away. It was based on sort of a jury-rigged lighting board that had very basic, basically 6 buttons that you could push to accomplish various tasks, like fade up a sound or fade down a sound or turn lights on or turn lights off. Basically 1 button per function. And it ran on a Z80 processor. It used stored cues on an 8-inch floppy disk and took input from 22 radio antennas buried in the street at each theoretical zone boundary where we had control over groups of speakers. And the idea was that each float would have its own transmitter, and as it crossed each of these antennas, we would get a signal that said, this float number is at this location, and we could make a cue happen to change music or turn the light on or whatever we needed to do. And that was basically the only functionality we had at that point. All the floats were synchronized the same way the original electrical parade had been synchronized, which is through FM broadcast. Mm-hmm. Each float had 1 track of a master tape broadcast from an antenna that first was on the castle for the very first electrical parade and later moved to the top of the Matterhorn. And that master tape was played back from Audio Central, which is above the Lincoln Adventures with Mr. Lincoln at Disneyland.
Right.
So because I'm kind of newer to all this, are you talking just the music, or are you also talking about how the floats were actually controlled? Were they controlled through this track as well?
Well, all the float drivers had to do was turn on the amplifiers and drive. And then the system would know when they entered each zone, and we would have pre-designed instructions for what was to happen as each float entered each zone.
Gotcha. Wow. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a miracle it worked at all.
Well, it's amazing. It's amazing how, that type of thing seems to be recurring not only at Disney, but at other places. And it's like you say, it's a miracle that it worked, but it worked day in and day out and still does, I'm sure.
We had our share of interesting challenges over the years. We found very early on that the radio waves traveled differently at night than they do during the day. We had problems with bouncing off buildings. You had to tune it so that it was just strong enough to be picked up, but not so strong that it carried to a bunch of sensors at once. So it was a bit tricky, and we're glad that it worked as well as it did, but it certainly gave us a number of headaches.
Right. Sure.
Which is why we pushed on with the technology to develop our second generation, which was called DEX, or Disney Entertainment Control System.
Why don't we go ahead and jump into that, because that's a question we have. What is DEX? And then we also, I guess the next iteration would be Conductor. Could you tell us about what DEX is and what it does and what differentiates all of this from Mickey Track?
DEX was a response to the rapidly advancing technology of DOS-based computers and, personal PCs. You could put something under your desk and it would have quite a substantially increased degree of computing power. And once those machines started to become available, I worked with another gentleman from the entertainment area named Jeff Roach, who was a specialist in IT. And we laid out how to take everything we had learned from Mickey Track and make it better. How could we streamline the queuing process, How could we improve the interface? What other kinds of functions could we add? And how could we make the system more reliable by structuring the queues in such a way that it was impossible for them to execute out of the correct sequence? And we got a budget for that, and we engaged the services of a coding company out of San Diego. And they proceeded to expend the entire budget and develop a system that wasn't quite finished. And when we got it back in early 1992, we had to get the Scientific Systems Division of Disneyland to give us somebody to help us finish it. And that gentleman's name is Jim Holman, and he quickly came up to speed on the operating system that was required. It ran under OS/2, which, if you know anything about computers, OS/2 was obsolete almost the day it was invented. So, but it had features that allowed us to do the kinds of intricate timing that we required. So we were kind of stuck with this operating system. But the system worked pretty well and allowed us to weed out bad sensor hits, have queues execute more reliably. We had a lot more flexibility, and we had an interface designed that was more to the point of what we needed to accomplish, and we didn't have to rely on 8-inch floppies anymore. There was actually a hard drive where we could store multiple shows without having to swap disks and switch modes and do all kinds of logistical switching that was necessary with Mickey Track. All that was obsoleted, and DEX went online in 1982 and ran all the way up until 2014, I believe, at Walt Disney World, 2015 here at Disneyland. Now we have Conductor, which is a different kind of a system. It's a software module that we add on to an existing piece of show programming software. Our in-house guy, Jim Holman, retired, and so it was time to move into a new generation, and Shanghai Disneyland was under development, so that meant we had a lot more requirements that we had to meet, so it made sense to go in a new direction and evolve our programming and float tracking and everything even further.
How much of this, Don, is... Because it sounds like there's a little finessing that goes with it. Is this like completely automatic, like somebody just hits a start button and the parade just goes? Or is there some kind of finessing that has to get done as the parade is taking place?
Well, all of our systems were intended to be, press go and sit back. And in general, if the hardware behaves, then there's nothing to do. But there's a lot of complicated hardware involved. With DEX, each float had its own onboard audio system that was different from the next float. And to make adjustments to the floats, either for level or EQ, or if something wasn't working right, you had to physically go to the float to make any change. Conductor allows us to talk directly to the float and make any changes on the hardware from master control.
Okay.
So if somebody says this float's broken, turn it off, our operators can immediately tend to that. We don't have to stop the parade and have somebody run out in the street and fling open a door and crawl inside and find the hardware and make the change. It's a lot slicker.
Yeah.
I'm sure that would be a little troubling. Somebody runs out, fixing a float during a parade. It's much better to just fix it on the fly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, mechanical things happen. We've had floats break a caster and tilt to one side and refuse to move.
Right.
We've had batteries run down, requiring a tug to come out.
Seen that. Been there, done that.
Yeah. Anything can happen. So mostly the systems are designed to be set up for each show where the operator basically watches and is ready in case anything happens, and then trained to know where to go in the system to make whatever is an appropriate correction. If a speaker's out or sounds bad, they can shut it down. If for some reason there's a radio broadcast going on beside the parade route, we can shut off a zone so that they don't get parade bleed into their local production. We have basically control over every speaker in the park at our command now.
That's amazing. So currently, in the parades, do we still have drivers? Do we still have humans inside of, like, I know that one of the parades that we have here at Walt Disney World, I look at the guy who's controlling the fire breathing dragon and I see him driving it, but on other floats, are there still people inside?
Oh, yes. As you know, safety is number one priority.
Right.
And it takes a set of eyeballs to know if a kid is jumping out in front of you or if a performer is tripped. And also just to judge the spacing between floats to keep the parade looking good.
Right.
There is no plan to automate float driving. What we have done with Conductor, though, is we give the drivers a little bit of help. Each one has a screen off to one side that helps them judge their distance between each float, so they can know if they're at their optimum spacing or if they're following too close or too far behind. And this is particularly helpful as they go around a curve where they can't really see in front of them where the next float is. Yeah. Their job is to move the float, but to look out for performers and guests that might potentially be in harm's way. So we don't have any undesired accidents.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Not that there are desired accidents, but...
Correct. Correct. Well, there was that one time that one kid was just being a pain in the butt. So tell us, and this is new to me because I've really only been a Disney person for going on 11 years. Tony is actually the old salty pro. So tell us a little bit about Laserphonic Fantasy and then how that morphed into the IllumiNations.
Well, there's quite a history to the Epcot Lagoon, and Laserphonic Fantasy was born out of a New World Fantasy, which was the first summer show at Epcot, which was born out of Carnaval de Lumière, or the Festival of Festivals, which was created for the opening of Epcot but lasted only a week. I was contracted to do the music track for the original show, Festival of Festivals, and that show did not survive due to its content and poor use of technology. And a bunch of producers from around the world who were known for their expertise in multimedia productions were called in and shown around the hardware. Here are the floats we have. Here are the fountains we have. Here are the projections we have. How would you make a better show than what we started with? And at that time, I was a consultant to the fountain programming and also to the fireworks programming. So I got to be a part of those production meetings. And I went to my vice president afterwards, and I said, it'd be great if they could use the same music track because it's all modular. It could be edited. It could be anything could be added or subtracted. And would it be okay if I pitched a show idea as well? And he said, tell you what, we'll get up early. We'll come in on the day when all these people are going to present, and you can talk to us about your ideas. So I did. Adam Bezark and myself put together a show, and we had an artist create an entire storyboard. And we came in, we pitched our concept, and lo and behold, by the end of that day, they picked us to create New World Fantasy for the opening summer. And that show was too successful by Disney's standards. And what I mean by that is that it was based on a proscenium view from Showcase Plaza. And all the restaurant owners were annoyed because guests would leave the restaurants early to go around to Showcase Plaza to sit and find a good place for the show. So Laserphonic Fantasy debuted in the summer of 1984 specifically to redo the show in the round so that people could, get up from their table, go watch the show for 10 minutes, come back, finish their dinner, spend more money, have a great time. And various versions of Laserphonic Fantasy evolved through 1986. And then marketing came up with the word, IllumiNations. And they came to Adam and me and they said, what does that mean to you? What would you guys do? So we said, obviously, it implies that you're using the pavilions now. So let's recraft the show, keep it in the round, obviously, and involve all the pavilions, put lights on them, project on those where projection is possible, and reworked some of the music. Some of the original arrangements I did were kept and turned into orchestral arrangements, and a whole new middle section was crafted to be a little more to cover a little more of the musical textures of all the countries we visited. And that became IllumiNations. That opened in January of '87.
That's fascinating. So this whole transformed from a proscenium to in the round, and then we moved it to IllumiNations, and it's morphed over the years. That's amazing. How much? I mean, this is because I don't know how much different is it from when you started the show to its current iteration.
It's substantially different. The first show involved slides. And by that I mean pictures of artwork from historical paintings and wood carvings and illustrations. It was called the Festival of Festivals because it celebrated celebrations around the world throughout history.
Right.
And the images were highly detailed. They were 500 to 600 feet away from you on a barge with a rear projection screen with Kodak home ectographic slide projectors that just did not have enough light output to effectively project that level of detail.
Right.
So what Adam and I realized early on was we needed to take these 5 individual barges and we need to put them in pairs and create imagery that was across the entire pair of barges instead of using the 4 corners of a single barge. So we changed the visual style of the show to be very colorful and graphic like cartoons. We kept the music track from Festival of Festivals, restaged the fountains, changed some of the fireworks around, and created a very, very wide proscenium look that was quite overwhelming. Our finale was also a bunch of white fireworks shells. But when you consider your entire periphery filling with that, it makes quite an impact. And so we tried to keep that sort of wide vista in the finale of reflections. But when you go from that kind of wide panorama to a show in the round where it's basically located in the center of the lagoon, it feels a little bit smaller when you do that, but it presents to more guests. So that was a compromise that we had to make just to get the show into the round format.
It's interesting. I had the pleasure of listening to Ron Logan talk about all the stuff that's happened in Epcot, all the entertainment and stuff. And, he was talking about the glider show, and then he was also talking about Laserphonics and IllumiNations and all those things. It's fascinating to see how these things progress, the entertainment changes. And it changes pretty frequently, I think. But it's very interesting to hear.
Well, Reflections has been playing it's in its 18th year now.
Right.
Every night. The show was designed to last 5 years, and here it is, year 18, and still going. And I believe there's a new show planned for the anniversary coming up in 2021. Mm-hmm. But I consider that a pretty good run.
Yeah, that is a great run. Great run. So tell us about some of the things that you did at Tokyo Disney Sea. This is a park that we both would love to go to and haven't been to yet. It's on our list of places to go. So tell us about some of the stuff that you did at Tokyo Disney Sea Park, like maybe Starlight Magic.
That was Tokyo Disneyland.
Okay.
And we can go there, or we can wrap up Disney Sea. The Disney Sea story is a little vaguer because I was involved from October of 1995 through March of 1998. And we started, the first 4 or 5 months was sort of generic entertainment planning. WDI had come up with a basic layout of the park and some suggestions for entertainment venues. And there was about a 10-person committee chaired by Larry Billman and Steve Kirk. And I was fortunate to be asked to participate. And what we did was we looked at each venue and we talked about the kinds of shows that could be produced in each one, recommending different approaches, different styles. We looked at character use and how different characters would be more or less appropriate for Disney Sea versus Disneyland. We talked about atmosphere groups where they would want to play, and that helped WDI finalize the park design and where they had to provide sound support and so on. All that preliminary information was basically a working group with entertainment and WDI to form the basic entertainment package for the park. And then starting in March of 1996, I moved on to getting specific with a nighttime lagoon show development. And we went through several iterations of large-scale lagoon shows. At one point, we had a moving island element. It was originally part of the promenade. There's a sort of a circular area off to the left as you're looking out towards the volcano, and that was going to break off and move towards the center and become part of the show. And we were talking about a sea monster or a sea serpent that would come up out of the lagoon at some point and challenge Mickey, similar to Fantasmic. And to do that, we had to create a pit in what was becoming the lagoon, so that we could put this mechanical creature down under the boat traffic that was going to be running around all day long. And as we went on and did various development, it was decided that for opening day, they didn't need a big spectacular. They wanted something a little more medium-sized that was easier to produce and cost less, and they would postpone the big-scale show until a few years into the park when they needed an attendance boost. So I worked for a while on sort of an electrical water pageant type show in 3D. It was based on Aladdin. The finale was the floats would transform by rotating over and become a magic carpet and fly Aladdin and Jasmine around the lagoon. There'd be fireworks, and we would involve the volcano, and it would be a pretty straightforward production on a smaller scale, but still a lot of fun for the park guests. And then in 1998, I wrapped up my work on that because I was getting very, very involved in the Millennium, and we were into producing reflections. And I was on a plane every week somewhere in the world, either to Japan for Starlight Magic, or to Florida for Reflections of Earth, or to London to do recording. That was my year of gathering frequent flyer miles like I never had.
Wow.
Nice. So let me ask this question, bringing you back to the stage for just a second. Can you tell us what you did for Disney's Fantasmic?
Fantasmic. Over many years, Adam Bezark and I, having done the lagoon shows at Epcot, were asked to come up with something for Disneyland. And we looked at the Rivers of America and said, this is like the biggest gathering place other than Main Street and Hub, where you could have a large enough audience to justify a major expenditure for some form of entertainment. So we decided on that location, and we started thinking, what sort of show could we make that was appropriate to New Orleans Square? And Adam was a big fan of the Haunted Mansion, so we explored down that path. And Dennis Despy, who was the vice president at that time, encouraged us to pursue a show concept that was a little edgier, a little more off the beaten track of what a Disney character show normally is. He said, don't be afraid to go to dark places. If you're going to use the Haunted Mansion, that's a perfect jumping off point. Make it scary, make it fun, make it magic. So we consulted with a couple of very well-known magic designers, including David Copperfield, and went to see lots of magic shows and investigated Fire on the Water. We investigated using the pirate ship as a ghost pirate scene. We involved the Mark Twain as a ghost ship. We looked at all these things that we could do on the rivers. And then at some point, after doing presentations all the way up to the Dick Nunes level and getting a lot of enthusiastic response, Dennis decided that it was going to be too much money, and we were never going to drain the lagoon. We were never going to put in a dock behind behind the service area. It's just too much trouble to do all of this stuff. So the show was turned off at that point until Barnett Ritchie happened to be in another meeting with Michael Eisner and came out of the meeting, and Michael Eisner said, we really should do something on the river. And Barnett had been looking at my work and started talking to Michael about the possibilities for the river, and he got excited and she got excited, and so she came up with the character-based version called Fantasmic, using much of the research that Adam and I had done as a basis for creating the effects in the show. And so at that point, it became Barnett's show and not my show, and I was tasked by Bruce Healy, the music director, to work with him on recording the soundtrack and doing the sound effects design, because that in and of itself was a large enough task that I couldn't be doing both that and directing the show at the same time. So that's what I did. We recorded orchestra in L.A., and then back to my production studio where I did all the sound effects design and post-production, transferring to Laserdisc, which is what we used for playback when the show opened. And then when Fantasmic moved to Walt Disney World, I had all the materials broken down so they were able to take it back apart and create new segments and slot those in and use some of the original effects and create new effects, put the thing back together as a different incarnation for Disney Studios.
Right. What is Don, what's the hardest technical thing with Fantasmic? I mean, I can venture a guess, but what is that? In terms of physical production or audio production? Either one.
In audio production, the most critical part is the final mixing, where you're trying to make the sound effects not overpower the music, but be present just enough to feel natural. Most people probably don't focus or they're not really aware that there are sound effects in the musical soundtrack because they enhance the video without standing out by themselves. We're not there to make a point of the sound effects. We're there to create the emotional experience of the total effect of the music and the character voices and the sound effects. Getting all of those pieces together and working in the right balance is probably the trickiest. And we did, several remixes and rebalances, and the production at Disneyland was the first time that we had used a surround sound system. We actually had 7 different speaker locations on rooftops behind the audience. And over physical distances, there are issues to consider, like timing, because there's a natural delay over physical distance in air of sound coming from a speaker. So some of the sounds had to be advanced so that they sounded correct at the main audience area, and other sounds had to be delayed different ways. There was a lot of complicated audio production simply because of the surround system and trying to make that all work correctly. Physical production-wise, I would guess that the hardest part is maintaining all the stuff that lives under the water all day long, because as you know, the rivers, even though it's a cement bottom now, it's not the cleanest water. It's not like you'd want in your swimming pool. Right. And so all of those hardware devices that live down there day in and day out are subject to growth and dirt and whatever else may fall into the lagoon. A guest from time to time, I suppose. Right. And to get to those for maintenance, they either have to be mechanized to come up out of the water so somebody can get to them, or you have to drain the lagoon, which has been done a couple of times, but it's a big project.
Very interesting. We could probably go on for hours and maybe even days talking about all the stuff that you've done, and then we've got to enjoy as guests going to Disneyland and Disney World and Disney Tokyo and all over the place. So we really want to thank you for coming on the show and telling your great stories. And maybe we'll have you back and we can talk about some other stuff that you've done too, if you don't mind. And
it would be my pleasure, guys.
Yeah. And so tell everybody, if they want to go read your bio and find out a little bit more about you, where they can go look for that, Don.
Well, you can go to dondorsey.com or dorseyproductions.com or dondorseyconsulting.com. They all lead you to the same place.
Okay.
You can see some information about my various projects, what I'm working on now, get a glimpse into some of my strange Christmas cards, and hopefully get some more information. You can find out about my CDs, and you can get those on iTunes or Amazon or anywhere. And would appreciate anybody's visit. If they want to send me a question, just click on the link.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Don, we want to say thanks again, but we also, as Disney fans, speaking for the entire Disney community, we just want to say thank you because of the hard work that you and the Imagineers and all the other creatives that go into inventing, creating, and putting on these amazing shows. You help make our dreams come true. So we just want to say thank you for all the work that you've done for us.
Oh, you're very welcome, guys. It's been a blast for me to be part of this, and my payoff is standing behind the audience and enjoying them enjoying the show. And there's no other job like I've been able to have, and I'm very, very pleased to have the effects that we've accomplished over the years.
All right, and thank you for coming on. As we'd like to say around here, we'll see you in the parks.
The Disney Parks Podcast is not affiliated with the Walt Disney Company. All Disney parks, attractions, lands, shows, event names, etc. are registered trademarks of the Walt Disney Company.
Like a bolt out of the blue, fate steps in